And this is a really cool kind of topic to take a deep dive in. It's one that's always been close to my heart, and something that I'm deeply interested in, because I think we spend a lot of time, when we're talking about the art of documentary filmmaking, we think about the way images are captured and the way the story is shaped, the sort of cinematography and editing and all these elements of the craft. But I think a really important component of that, and really the thing that many documentaries hinge on. Oh, hey, Jon, just under the wire. Jonathan Olshefski. The thing that many documentaries hinge on is access. And that can be access to an individual or individuals, an institution, set of visual resources that go up on screen. But really, everything that we see in a film somehow started with a relationship that was built. And as such, I think access can be a really messy topic. It really varies dramatically from film to film. It involves the sort of communication between a director or producer and the subject, and it involves trust and responsibility. So I want to kind of dive into all of those questions, and also just sort of the different strategies and methods and processes that you've all kind of taken towards building that relationship with the people or the institutions that you put on screen. But I want to start and kind of we're gonna go through each of these incredible filmmakers' works and get a little kind of taste of each film. But I'd love for you to kind of set up the clip, just give us a one-liner of what the film's about, and then when we come back, just one or two lines about how access or lack of access maybe shaped what ended up on screen. And then as we get further into the conversation, we can kind of do a deep dive into just the sort of winding road that each of you took towards completing these films. So let's start with Assia Boundaoui.
Sure. So the film is The Feeling of Being Watched. We're going to show a short trailer here. It's a personal and investigative film about 2 decades of FBI surveillance in the Muslim American neighborhood where I grew up outside of Chicago. And we'll just see a brief teaser.
So just real quickly in terms of access, we can go into this stuff a little bit later. I think that I kind of see it in 3 different ways. One is, the access to the characters that you see in the film. And we can talk about getting access to John Adams, who was the investigative reporter, who kind of becomes our lens to discover this mystery that's unfolding. One of the other main characters, totally different story in terms of access, was the guy who ends up in the trial at the end of the film and doing the dance of trying to gain access to somebody who was a very big part of it and probably didn't want to be a very big part of it. Was an interesting dance that took place over the 6 years it took to make this film. And then there's kind of 2 other areas of access that I think are interesting to talk about. One is that, there was an issue that I found pretty interesting and thought would be a pretty good film, but I couldn't pull the trigger on making a film about that until the access was in place, until it felt like this is really something that was going to come together and wasn't just going to be an issue documentary that we shoved down audiences' throats, because I wanted to find that story, and that didn't come. The constellation of events that was necessary to make that film happen didn't click into place until there was access. We can talk more about that. And the other thing that I think is kind of interesting when you're making a political film is over access, and by that I mean when there are a lot of people who, as soon as word about the film got around, they wanted to be part of it for partisan purposes. So doing that dance as well was pretty interesting, and to figure out what people's motivations are, where to allow people access and where to just say no thanks, that's a little bit too much, was an interesting discussion too. So we can talk more about that.
Thank you. All right, John, you made it with 10 minutes to spare, I think.
Yep. Apologies on that, but yeah, we're here.
No, so glad you're here. And I think, you know, all of these films really wouldn't have been possible without access, but certainly yours is just such an intimate story that really required a deep relationship. So yeah, if you could set it up.
Yeah, Quest is nothing without the relationship sort of as the foundation. Yeah, Quest is a portrait of an American family. It's 10 years in the life of a family living in North Philly. Maybe we could just show the clip. Yeah, so Quest started, it was a chance encounter. I sort of fell in love with North Philly before I even met the Rainey's, and was looking for ways to sort of contribute and give back in the neighborhood, and ended up teaching a photo class. And just happened that this guy named JC was in my class, and one day he was like, hey, my brother runs a hip-hop studio out of his house a couple blocks away. Do you want to meet him? So I'm like, okay, sure. So we wander over. Quest opens up the door, had a bit of an awkward initial interaction, but a couple of weeks later, he reached out to me and said, hey, would you mind coming to the studio to take some pictures to sort of help us, you know, promote our artists? And I showed up thinking it would be just a one-off photo shoot, and was just blown away by sort of just the energy of the studio, the passion, and sort of we ended up doing this, you know, little photo essay. And kind of the beginning, it was just about sort of working life versus a creative life. So we thought we were doing a little project about a guy with a studio who had a paper route. But, you know, with the photo thing, I ended up sleeping over the house, got to know the kids, the rest of the family, and just saw that there's this other layer here. And, you know, we just kind of kept going. A year and a half later, I kind of felt like, hey, maybe there's a short little documentary, and kind of proposed that to the family, and was like, let's try that. I'd never made a documentary before, but I was like, let's figure this out. So that was in 2007. We ended up not making a short little documentary. It took a little bit longer than any of us would have imagined. But I think over the years, that relationship, it got deeper and deeper. And then a number of years in, like, life got real. You know, early on, it was sort of just quiet routines. And then some pretty intense stuff happened with the family, and they kind of kept inviting me back and bringing me into these really intimate spaces. And then, yeah, this huge weight of responsibility to get it right and really reflect their story from their point of view. And I think that was like the challenge, to kind of figure out how do we do that.
That's great. So clearly some just incredible films represented here, and just a whole range of kind of approaches to documentary subjects that all ended up with extraordinary work. So I guess what I want to do is sort of start from the beginning and talk a little bit about, you know, Kim, you mentioned sort of not being sure whether you could make this film about campaign finance reform until you had access or had a subject that was sort of worth following. And I'd like to just, you know, think about, you know, access is on one level just about kind of getting the signature, getting the consent form, permission to follow somebody around and film them. But how did you find you know, your journalist in the first place? When did you cross that threshold, and how did you start to build a relationship and you know, realize that this was, you know, a story that could carry a film?
Yeah, originally the film really started before I met the journalist. Seeds were planted for the film when I heard about the Citizens United decision from the Supreme Court that said corporations are people and money is speech. And I think, like tons of people, I just thought, that's a terrible idea. This is an important issue. Somebody should do something about that. And as a documentary filmmaker, I think I sort of wanted to do something about it, but there wasn't a film there. You know, how do you, what's your angle on it? And it wasn't until my home state of Montana, a couple of years later, had a case that was going to the U.S. Supreme Court. So that was an interesting kind of story that you could wrap it around. And that court case was being headed by an attorney general in Montana who I knew I could get access to. We went to the same high school. Kind of a small town, even though it's a big state, and I knew I would be able to follow him. So that was the sort of galvanizing moment where it's like, okay, we have a story here. The court case involves Montana defending this 100-year-old law that banned corporate contributions to political campaigns. So there was going to be this historical aspect that was going to bring in, this history of corporate control of really the whole state of Montana and the environmental disasters that corporate control created. So I knew there was going to be this historical aspect to it that could build some context for this story, and it would be something that could be applied to not just this one microcosm of the story in Montana, but to every other state. So that's where things really, really took off. And I just grabbed a camera and started filming. As I dug into the story more, I appealed to some of the journalists who were covering the story, and one of them was this guy, John Adams. There are a couple more. John was maybe the most dynamic character that was covering this story. He was certainly the youngest. I just did my homework and read everything he wrote and appealed to him and contacted him. Tried really early on. It was about, I guess, a year into filming to get him to go on camera, to be this envoy, to be our narrator, to be this lens through which we could see the story. But he was a journalist, and journalists don't like going on camera. They don't like being part of the story. As you probably found too, right? They just like kind of sit and it's hard to convince them to go on camera. After about a year of sticking with it, I think that he saw that I was committed to it. I think he saw that I was being fair-minded as a journalist who was a documentary filmmaker. That meant that he could be comfortable with it wasn't going to pull him to one side or the other and following this. I was going to let him keep his own journalistic independence. And he finally, went on camera. And from there on out, the story got deeper. He kept digging, and he became that good lens that I wanted to tell the story through. So it was a dance that took about a year to convince him to go on camera.
And it seems that part of that, this approach and this building of a relationship built on trust is kind of describing what your intentions are as a filmmaker, what your vision for the film is, or how you're going to represent these people that are kind of making themselves vulnerable in some way. I wonder, Caitlin, since you've worked on kind of so many different types of projects, there's Obit, which we saw as this kind of I'm sure kind of a challenging negotiation with an institution that kind of understands what it means to be part of a film. But you've worked on some other projects as well that you might have had to educate them a little bit about kind of what a feature documentary is, or where it might end up, or how you wanted to follow them around in a way that might be distinct from how say a journalist would get access.
Right, and I think that in documentary, the relationship is generally more prolonged than in journalism, and I can't really speak to that because I'm not a journalist, but I would say the technique is different depending on the subject and depending on their sort of experience in what it means to be a subject. So with the Times, it was a very surgical approach. It was an incredibly detailed ask. I think it was also just incredibly transactional, that we licensed the font. Like every single thing that you see on the screen is something where we paid the Times and we have a legal document saying we can use this headline, we can't use this headline, had a legal review. And so I think that our filming was incredibly limited. I think that we were in the newsroom for maybe three total days. And then the interviews were all with the writers on their own time, on their own turf. So it was something where they were very comfortable because they had everything really beautifully written out. I think that I was thinking of a sort of two of the images that come to mind in terms of like the way that I build access are email cheetah and kindly brontosaurus. And I got that from, someone was talking about kindly brontosaurus on the internet. And for me, that's like, you're so large that you can't be ignored, but you're sort of a benevolent presence. And I did an observational doc called We Could Be King, and that was something that was working within certain institutions, but also largely with a lot of marginalized groups. And so it was really important for both the school district in Philadelphia, which was going through its own tough time, and the public defender's office, and also all of these people who were not necessarily empowered to give consent in other aspects of their life, to be treated with the same regard. But for me, my technique with that is like, it's the brontosaurus, which is just, I'm gonna show up at the public defender's office and be like, I'm just gonna sit there. And I'm gonna sit there until they wanna get rid of the annoying white lady in the lobby who's just like kinda hanging out, because they have higher priorities. And the email cheetah is sort of the opposite response with someone like the principal of a school or the family of a football player who's incarcerated, is to just make them feel very comfortable that you are, like, they are your priority. You are a human being interacting with them who is trying to tell a story, and they're an important part of that story, which does not mean that control of that story is ceded to them, but that if they have a question, I'm here to answer that. And so, because they don't have those protections, and because members of their community have not necessarily been fairly represented in different spaces, just being present and available and kind of having, like on my part, having really bad boundaries and like sleeping with my phone by my ear really worked in getting that access for certain people, because it was something where there was confidence built in that I was not going to ignore them. I was not going to take something from them and go away, that it was that I was giving of myself in that space to get that access.
That's great. And have you ever been in a situation where you had to sort of share some of your previous work in order just to kind of, kind of build a literacy of like, what is a feature documentary? Some people aren't exposed to
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
regularly.
And I think that there's, I'm very fortunate to have a large body of work and to have a sort of diverse body of work, because it means that I can pick and choose and say, you know, if I'm trying to get access to this church where the refugee soccer club is having a meeting for funding, I'm going to show them the like very heartwarming doc about the blind senior swimmer and my like empowering football movie, and not the like Church of Satan movie or the like goat testicles movie. Like, they don't need to see that, and they can do their own deep dive, but a lot of people don't bother, which has kind of backfired in that when I was making a short for Field of Vision, we were trying to film in a library, and someone else had gotten us the permission to film there, and then the librarians, because they're research-driven fields, called me back, and they're like, I went to the Field of Vision website, and there's movies on here that are called like Best of Luck with the Wall. This is not just like an interview, this is going to be a political piece, and that's not something that we can like represent in our library. So, but that's an empowered subject. That's someone who knew that they could go to the internet and do a little bit more research. I don't think that I would necessarily, if I was emailing that library, I would have left Field of Vision out of my email signature, which doesn't mean that I'm preventing them from getting the information about me, but I'm not delivering it to them.
And that kind of brings us to some of the power dynamics, I guess, that play out between a filmmaker and a subject. And I think, Assia, your case is really interesting because you're kind of trying to pull back the veil on this very powerful institution, the FBI, the impacts that a surveillance program had on your community. But in the process of sort of starting down one path and then realizing that you might have issues sustaining access there, and then kind of turning the camera back on yourself and on your family. And I think it's a great example of how, as a film evolves, the scope of it changes, your relationship to your subjects, and your subjects change. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of more about that pivot, and then sort of how you negotiated access with your family, with yourself, how you made that decision to be the protagonist essentially in your film.
Yeah, It's complicated. I mean, documentary film, you start out thinking it was going to be, a short film, and then 10 years later you have, a feature-length epic. But, it's constantly changing and evolving, and it's supposed to be organic. And so that means your relationship and your access is also constantly changing and ought to be constantly negotiated. And then particularly when you're making a film about the place where you're from, you don't have the luxury of parachuting in and getting airlifted out afterwards. So you really have to, you're extra responsible for everything because you're going to be here way after the film ends, and you're going to be here after the people have seen the film, the people that are in it, et cetera. So you can't make promises lightly. You really, people are going to hold you to your word, so you better be sure about what you're doing and what you're saying. And the film, it changed. I mean, it evolved a lot. So, I started by going door to door in my neighborhood, asking people about their experiences with surveillance and what have they seen over the years, what have they experienced themselves, et cetera. And that's really hard. I mean, so you're making a film about surveillance in a neighborhood that has been traumatized by the camera lens and by this gaze from the outside, and you're carrying a camera and you're asking them to relive their trauma with being seen a certain way. And so that's really complicated. It's very difficult to walk around in a neighborhood that has been surveilled for decades with a camera. And so you're negotiating access all the time. The fact that I'm from there really helped, but still, so first we went and asked people about their experiences, and then I don't want to ruin too much about the film, but we file a Freedom of Information Act with the FBI asking them for all of the records about the surveillance of my neighborhood, and they admit to having 33,000 pages of documents, and then they tell me they can't give me access, and so it turns into a long legal battle. I sue the FBI for the records. And then at that point, I'm going back into the community to ask people to sign privacy waivers. So the FBI admits they have 500 individual records on people, and so it becomes, instead of just asking people, I'm not just asking you about your experience, now I want you to be a part of this legal process to uncover the records about surveillance of our community. So what I was asking from people kept getting heavier. And so first I'm asking them just for their stories, and then I'm asking them, will you sign a privacy waiver so if you have a record with the FBI, they will release it to me? And that's another thing. They're releasing records that they don't even know what they contain to me. And I will have, I would have the legal right to see them before they do. So it's a lot of trust you're asking from people, and I think we had to build those relationships. And I think maybe in the beginning, I took for granted, oh, this is my neighborhood, this is my family, I can just film whenever I want, and that's okay because they all know me, and that's not the case. I realized really quickly, even with my family, that I had to, make the same sort of formal efforts that I do with other people when I interview them, that I had to extend that courtesy to my family too, and not just expect that they would be cool with me showing up to film Thanksgiving dinner without asking them beforehand. They were really pissed about that. So, so there were things like that you learned that, yeah, this is your story, but this is a lot of other people's story as well, and the way you handle it is really important. And also, I'm going to be asking a lot more from people, and so if they have concerns about security, about repercussions from law enforcement, those are very real because they're involved not just as subjects, but now they're also involved in my investigation. They're actively involved in my investigation by having, conceded to having me access their personal file. And so that became really, it became really important not just to say, oh, I'm making this film to tell this story of ours that hasn't been told, but I'm also, I think that it became important also to think about what is the benefit for the community from doing this. So instead of, we think of oh, how do I not be an extractive filmmaker? How do I not just go into this place and take a story and leave? And that's that's the first question you ask. I think taking it one step further is, instead of thinking of not leaving harm, what kind of benefit can I leave for the place, instead of just not doing harm? And in this case, it was, our community will have the records of the surveillance that the FBI has been doing on us for the last 2 decades. And that will be available, publicly to everyone in the community. And then it was like, oh, well, how will I do that? How will I actually present the findings? So at the end of the film, at the end of the production, we had a town hall meeting in the community where I presented my investigation. You guys have seen me filming for all this time. This is what I've been up to. I actually printed a lot of the documents and put them up and allowed people to actually engage with them. So that they felt that they were a part of this thing as well. And also they felt like I'm not just answering questions for myself in the film, I'm answering questions for everyone because these are relevant to everyone. So it required really thinking about what's in it for people. If they actually think they're endangering themselves by talking out loud on camera about this very, very sensitive topic, what are they getting out of it other than risk? And it became important to say, well, the answers that I'm going to get are for you too, and and it was important to find a way to share them, and also to keep people posted on what I was up to, and share what I'd been finding out in the investigation throughout the process.
I think you did such an extraordinary job of kind of walking this sort of ethical line, and one of the things that's interesting to me is, in some cases, you need a certain scene. Maybe you need that Thanksgiving dinner, in order to tie the film together. I don't know if that was the case in this. But did you ever have a moment where you had to kind of push a little bit outside of people's comfort zone and assure them that, it's worthwhile, this is what's needed to tell this wider story? Or, how did you kind of figure out where that line was?
I think and this was, I could understand and really empathize with why people didn't want it, because I was feeling a lot of the same feelings when I put myself in front of the camera. And I think one of the effects of being under surveillance for such a long time is it turns you into a hyper-private person. You feel like whatever privacy you have, you want to hold on to it and really, really guard it. And so this was me and my family. I'm a hyper-private person. My family is very private. And so asking them, trying to explain why it was important to film, inside the house, holidays, things that they thought were not, what does this have to do with the FBI and surveillance? Was really hard because of that, because we were really cherished our privacy and we felt invaded, and I felt invaded in those moments. And the case that I would make was that this is, a story about how 2 decades of surveillance also personally affected us, and how we react to it and how we live our lives differently because of all of this surveillance. And so filming the ordinary moments and filming what you think are mundane is very important for this, because it's not just about, the dramatic things, it's about the little ways our lives have changed because of this. So that was the case I needed to make. The other case I made to people was being public about this will make you safer. Then, that this being a secret for such a long time has not made our community safer at all, and having a public profile will make you safer, which is what I said to myself, is how I justified taking certain risks for myself. And I really believed those things, and that's what I said. But at the same time, you're taking a lot of risks, making assurances to people that you can't 100% back up, because you don't know if someone is arrested or investigated, where, what could happen and what is our role and responsibility. Thank God nothing like that happened while we were filming, but it was always on the back of our mind, yeah. And in terms of also support and the team that we had to build around us, it was really important to keep that in mind, that we're asking a lot of the people that are giving us access are taking a lot of risks, and what does that mean in terms of legal backup that we can provide, that we need to provide if that happens, et cetera. So building your team around knowing that your subjects are taking a lot of risks is really important. That should inform your production in a lot of ways.
Jon, I feel like you must have been in a lot of these situations as well. Just kind of, obviously you kind of had the access, you had the relationship early on, but every kind of situation you go in, you have to decide, am I filming this, am I not filming this? And clearly a lot of sensitive situations arose over the course of the 10 years that you were filming. So I wonder if you could talk about how you made those decisions of when to pick up the camera and hit record, You know, again, a family story. So there's a real sense of privacy and yeah, just kind of a fine line to walk there. So.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways I was following the lead of the Rainey family, and they're pretty extraordinary in the sense just in their, you know, long before I ever showed up, they were opening the doors of their house to the neighborhood to come into their living room or into their basement to record music. And so they're all about supporting artists, and I think on some level for them sort of going along with this whole process was just me being another artist that they wanted to support. I'm like, hey, John's got a good eye. Like, let's let him do his thing. Let's encourage him. And the kind of the deepening of that happened over the years was, again, following their lead. So there weren't really moments where I was having to push necessarily. Sometimes it was like, oh, I'd like to, film the paper out. It's like, oh, that's not really that interesting. Why would you want to come on that? It's a long day. You think you can keep up? And it's like, yeah, I'm up for it, you know. But other than that, you know, just was following their lead. And one example, pretty early on, you know, a couple months after we started filming, you know, video to make the documentary, transitioning out of the photo project, Quest's mom died. And prior to this, you know, the story, it was about the studio and the paper route, and maybe a little bit about sort of daily routines of like parenting. But this was like a pretty intense, you know, event. And Quest invited me to come to, you know, the funeral and to the services. And I brought all my camera gear, but it, you know, it was still, you know, maybe 2 years into our relationship. And I just felt like I need to be here present as a friend, not necessarily as a filmmaker. And so I was just there, just taking everything in, without the camera, you know, kind of in between. And I remember being at the cemetery, and Quest and his daughter PJ, who was, I mean, she's probably 7 or 8 at this time. They kind of, you know, went off to the side, and PJ had a balloon, and she like lets it go. And they're just standing there watching this. And it was like such a cinematic kind of moment that I noticed with my camera being in my bag. And I was like, oh, this would be amazing. But I didn't film it. But I ended up, you know, talking to Quest about it later. And I was like, oh, there's this moment, you know, at the cemetery. And just like, yeah. And he's like, you should have filmed that, dude. And I was like, that's why we have you around to film stuff. Like, why didn't you film it? I was like, okay, all right. So next time I'll keep that in mind. And so that was kind of their thing. It was like they would just sort of continue to keep their doors open. It was also a two-way street. It wasn't me just sort of existing kind of in their lives, in their home, but they, you know, they were at my wedding. They got to know my kids. My kids were in, you know, kind of in the house, or even when stuff got really intense, my son was with me at the hospital at the very beginning. And so it was definitely, you know, a two-way street, and it was just me too. So there wasn't like this big film team that we were having to navigate. It was just me with a camera, and sometimes we're just hanging out and not filming. And there wasn't the pressure to always get something. Sometimes, you know, the work of the day was just, hey, we're hanging out as friends and getting to know each other and watching kung fu movies or whatever. And that sort of leads to just this comfort that I could be in the room when other stuff was happening. And, you know, the moment when stuff really got intense, I guess I can spoil it. I guess that's what we're here for. But their youngest daughter, PJ, you know, I'd known her since she was 6 years old. About 5 years into the project, when she was 13, she was shot by a stray bullet, just kind of out of nowhere on a Sunday afternoon in June. And I was just heartbroken when I got the news. And then Quest reached out to me, and I was just like, hey, what can I do to support you guys? Actually, at this time, we're 5 years in. I was like trying to not film anymore, because my like process was always to get overwhelmed with all the footage and run away from the computer and go film more with the Rainies. Like that was always, you know, my go-to. I was like, I'm not gonna film. I'm gonna sit here. We're gonna figure out this story. But Quest, you know, was like, come to the hospital and bring your camera. We want PJ to know how strong she is, and we don't want this to happen to other kids and other families. And so they kind of invited me into this really intense space. And then I just felt so honored, but also just this huge weight of responsibility that I need to get this right. And I think the stakes changed, you know, early on. It was just, about what they do. And then it's about the family and the daily routines. But now here's a family in crisis. And then part of that too, you know, as early on, there was no funding. And then all of a sudden, funding starts to come in, which was great because that, kind of gave us the resources to, craft a really polished emotional story, but also meant a lot more people were going to see it too. We got funding from ITVS. It's like, okay, we were originally making a film in the neighborhood for the neighborhood, and now this is going to be on TV. And we talked about that too. And they were like, all right. And none of us knew really what that meant. And, we didn't know about festivals or anything, but they wanted to be understood. They wanted to be known in their complexity. And I think they wanted their neighborhood to be seen in its complexity. And that sort of vision was there from the very beginning, and is sort of what the kind of our goal was throughout the process. And I think that in that way we were able to kind of collaborate. And they were the first champions of this project. And without them, we've got nothing. So, yeah.
Can I just really underline something that Jon said that I think is really important that we don't really think about when we're talking about access, which sort of seems like this abstract negotiation that happens in pre-production or something. But the size of the crew and the impact that the crew has on your production is a really integral part of establishing that access and maintaining it once you're already like up in somebody's grill. And I say that having made in Prodigal Sons is autobiographical, and that was me kind of filming my family, which sounds a lot like kind of similar to what you were doing. And sometimes having produced other films that maybe went too far sometimes and showed up with 6 people on set and a boom pole, and the cops show up, and it really affects. Maybe you still maintain that same kind of legal access that you had to your character before, but it really shifts the way that people behave in front of the camera when the crew itself is so intimidating.
Can I pick up in
course.
a different way and look at demographics in terms of access? And I have a really good, this is not a personal anecdote, but I worked with Nancy Schwartzman, whose movie Roll Red Roll came out this year, and it's about the Steubenville rape case. And she shot that film with, I think it was just like 3 white men and her, and she's a white female-presenting woman. And there were a lot of times in football culture in Ohio where she kind of made herself scarce because she understood that these men wanted to have boy talk that was going to be significantly more honest and present than if they were talking to the nice lady. And I think about that in my own work, sort of like with my presentation, when I go to ask someone a question, I can't work in Steubenville because of like my haircut gives me away as a liberal. And there are certain questions that I know that like I would need to have a crew who presented differently than I do to be able to make people feel comfortable to get to the emotional truth of that. That's not true of every story, and I've definitely worked in a lot of spaces where I'm not the same demographic as the people that we're covering, but there are some, in addition to like smaller crew is less intimidating, also knowing who you're asking a question. From personal experience, it did, this was sort of a like spot for the gap in an HIV clinic in Nairobi, and we were interviewing a mother about parent-to-child transmission of HIV, and she had lost a child to HIV, and then her current kid, who's like 6 years old and the best person ever, did not get it because she had proper precautions. And that was not something where we could have our like looming sound guy or the creative from the agency who's just sort of like smoking and pacing. And it was just the director and I in a room that was small enough that we were all touching knees, hearing really intimate details, and everyone else stood outside, and everyone else also, we like ran and monitored the van. And that was what was necessary for those stories to come out and for it to not be the sort of like deer in headlights NGO canned response of like, yes, it's very important to take your ARVs, that it's something where 2 women are going to receive and have stewardship of another woman's story, and that she wanted to have that intimacy, and that was necessary to not have the full apparatus, even if it sacrificed quality, to be able to get to that emotional place.
And it's not to say that you always have to shoot with a small crew, because sometimes getting the big crew and the hair and makeup and primping and making somebody feel really special can be a really powerful thing too. I mean, cameras are magic, and I think we're just saying to be very aware of the size of the crew and the impact that it has on the characters that you're filming.
That's great. So I think we have some questions for the audience, and we have about.
This wonderful thing, and then there's a family member who's like, well, shit, I'm selling weed on the side over here. This is the last thing. So how does that affect your access? Did that happen? And how did it affect your access maybe in Philly or in Montana, where you're a reporter, all of a sudden there's something associated and they absolutely don't want anything to do. Anyway, how do you work through that? Yeah.
I think like that's part of negotiating the access as things change. And then also like, you can say like, I will never film this thing. You know, like I will say, oh, you don't want that filmed? Okay, we will not. Oh, you want to keep this part of your life or this part of your story out? You have the right to do that as the subject collaborator. Let's talk about that. So I can't think of specific examples in my film where, well, yeah, there are parts of people's lives that they didn't want necessarily in it. Even if it was like we're filming in someone's house and, you know, someone's like, my kitchen's really dirty, please do not, and like this woman is serious, do not film the kitchen. And you take, okay, we will not film the kitchen even in the background. So that's part of the access that you agree to, and that might change. And I think that it is your responsibility to make sure you don't accidentally incriminate anybody, that you don't film something that could legally get someone in trouble, and that you're very clear to them when you are filming that this is happening, or that what you won't do also, not just what you will do.
I kind of backed into, similar to you, becoming a film producer through a relationship, and it was with a black superintendent who came to lead the schools in Petersburg, Virginia, which had been the lowest performing district in the state for decades. And the whole story and the turnaround that he's brought about in that city is pretty compelling, but he was a friend. So I have a lot of access with him, but I first got in touch with Sam Pollard, who couldn't produce the film, but he's still involved with me. And Alice Elliott, similar. She had particular concerns about appropriation. And I'm a white guy, and everyone there practically in the film is not. And so that's not a problem with me based on some of the relationships, but I think that that's an issue in the film world potentially, and all of you have kind of broached that somehow. So for those who know me, I'm an undercover brother. For those who don't, I'm a white guy, producing a film. And I'm wondering how you bridged that particular potential stigma of appropriation that Alice Elliott had such concern about. And you can all go to Kickstarter.com and see Petersburg Rising. Thanks.
Yeah, I guess for me, again, it started off with this family with very sort of making film in the community for the community. So the idea wasn't like, oh, I'm going to get this, we're going to go to Sundance and, whatever. So I think it starts with a relationship with your subjects and what is it that you want to do together. But I think it's also kind of as you go deeper, knowing that any filmmaker, you have blind spots and there's power dynamics, and sort of building out a team that can sort of dialogue with you about those and shed light on your blind spots and bring different perspective. And so I don't know if Sabrina's in here, but producer Sabrina Schmidt-Gordon, was pretty integral, kind of to that process in terms of like, come on, like the black community is not going to be into like this, or this is this thing that we just get so annoyed with over and over again. So we need to be thinking about that for this scene or that scene. And so having, that is important. And I think getting the story right, getting it right, I think that is a big piece of it too. So that, this film can play, kind of in a number of communities and have it land. And so think about who are you making the film for.
That's great. Do we have another question?
Yeah, hey. I was just wondering if any of your accesses changed from when you were filming it to when it came out, when the film actually came out, and if your access was affected by the movie actually coming out. And if at any point during the edit you were thinking about that and how that went.
Why would you need access after the film came out? Can you explain? Can you explain that?
I guess it's more in terms of a relationship and access to that world that you've been in.
I could say just really briefly, I was really anxious about that. It's like, here, I've got this friendship with these people for 10 years, and felt so natural and beautiful. And then does a movie come out and it just feels like, oh, that was a means to an end. And so not necessarily in the edit, though I was always thinking about them in the edit, and wanted to make a film that we can all live with, and the film's gonna have its life, and we can be friends afterwards. That was super important, and happy to say that the Rainey's and I really enjoyed the exhibition process. We were doing a small little community screening in Philly on Friday. And so, but definitely was thinking about that, and fortunately, we got it right.
I think that this is why film festivals should have therapy. It sounds very cavalier, but I very truly mean this. In terms of the relationships you're building, these people are essential and they're really key in your life. And then there's the means to the end, there's the premiere, the thing exists outside of you. There's going to be a response that everyone has access to that you no longer control. I've had varied experiences with this. I produced a documentary about the radio station WFMU, which is led by one person, and it's his life's work. And it was really exciting to be able to make the film, but also this is the first time that someone's told his story and it's outside of his control, and he has total control over his narrative otherwise. And also he's a very empowered white man. But we got to a point, and it was very, very difficult ramping up to the premiere just because of those jitters about losing control and the station being out there in the world and the film being out there, and it wasn't a narrative that he had written. And ultimately, the rewarding part was that he would say, in Q&As, he would say, this is the director's Tim Smith, or premiered here. This is Tim's movie, this is Tim's way of telling my story, which is not to say that it's the perfect way, but it is the way that he has chosen to do it. But it's challenging, because I have had films where, especially if there are a lot of subjects, there's been a varied response. There are people who take issue with certain details, and it's heartbreaking when that relationship does change. And if you're dealing with a community, you won't ever get consensus. And I just think that that's a resource that we should provide more to documentary filmmakers, that you do have these relationships and things are gonna change. Or, I have people in We Could Be King. One of my kids is gonna be incarcerated for a long time for aggravated assault. And that's something that I can deal with personally, but it's sort of a unique relationship where he's someone who is the only thing I was thinking about for months and months of my life, and then necessarily fell off just because he moved on with his life. He went to college, I moved on to other projects, and sort of that balance of that relationship in the wake of the film is something that I think is very specific to this field, and something that we should provide us with more resources to properly process emotionally.
Definitely press is weird. Reviews.
We have time for 2 more questions.
I'll be quick. I'm just curious, sort of working off this point. John, I was curious specifically for your film, because you had such deep, sustained, intimate access to this family. Did you give them an opportunity to view the film before it premiered, and did you give them an opportunity without compromising your editorial independence to say, we prefer you didn't include this, or was there any discussion around that?
Yeah, so part of, I think, the relationship building was that there were versions of the film throughout the years. Early on, like we were doing, I had versions, we did a little community screening, they did Q&As, even in year 1, year 2. And so some of the conversation and dialogue we had then sort of informed kind of the direction things took later on. But then, the build up before our world premiere was crazy, and we were just like at the, kind of whatever. But yeah, I showed it to them, and we talked about it, and they actually felt really good about it. But then after it did premiere, there were some other conversations of like, none of our other kids sort of got, sort of featured, and all the press even was like, this family has 2 kids. It's like, no, there's other kids. They're just not part of this story, but we didn't explain that, and didn't feel like, do we need to explain every detail? And so, but we did have the opportunity to make some changes after we premiered, and kind of were able to get that little piece of information in, which was important to the family.
And I think it really depends on the film. With an autobiographical film with Prodigal Sons, I showed that to my family kind of every step of the way, and wanted to make sure that folks were cool with stuff, and that I wasn't going to do anything that was going to, do long-standing damage to our family. I didn't want to overstep that line. With Dark Money, I made the choice mostly because I had this relationship with John Adams, the investigative reporter. where he was just he was just overthinking everything so much, and how his story was gonna come across, and how he was gonna appear, and all of that stuff, that he just said, you know what, I just trust you. Just do it. I'm putting myself in your hands. I'm essentially, this is him talking, I'm essentially doing what people do with me when I interview them for a newspaper story. So just like, I trust you. So it was really, just based on that, on that relationship. And so with that film, which is completely different, I didn't show it to him until right at the very end. I think I showed him the cut that we submitted to Sundance.
I was just going to add also, we did the same. We screened it for my family. I really wasn't showing them footage over the process because I didn't want them to change how they were acting in front of the camera. They had like a real naivete to what it would end up being, which was very helpful because none of them were affected at all when the camera was rolling. But it was important that we showed it to them before we locked picture. And I think that, like, as filmmakers, we usually think like we're doing a favor to our subjects by showing them the thing, like we're doing a responsibility, but you get an enormous amount, I think, if you're actually open to critique from the people that have been on the other side of the lens of your camera for so long and have been watching your process too. And they can hold you also to account to what your vision originally was. The vision you articulated to even get the access in the beginning, was that something that you were true to, or how did that change? I think you get a lot if you show it to them before you lock with an actual opportunity to make changes. You get a lot from the feedback of showing it to folks that are actually in it.
So that's all the time we have, but I want to thank all of the panelists, all extraordinary filmmakers, and again, if you haven't seen any of these films, please check them out. You all done an incredible job of just kind of building and maintaining these relationships, but also balancing the needs of your films, and they're all just wonderful pieces of work, so thank you.
Hi, Sean.